What if the most dangerous lie in intelligence isn't the one the enemy tells you, but the one you tell yourself? In January 2026, one of the most powerful spy agencies on Earth walked into the office of a sitting prime minister and made a promise that would drag two countries into a war. The promise wasn't about bombs or missiles or assassinations. It was about people, ordinary Iranian people. And whether they would rise, they didn't. But before we get to what happened after, we need to go back to the man who knew, before anyone else admitted it, that something about this plan was already broken. His name, for the purpose of this story, is Reza, not his real name. His real name is known only inside a building in Tel Aviv that doesn't appear on tourist maps. But Reza is close enough. It's Persian, it fits, and it carries the weight of a man who was born inside the country he spent his adult life working against. Reza had been running intelligence assets inside Iran for 11 years, not from Tehran, from a desk and a network of encrypted lines that stretched from the Kurdish highlands in the west to neighborhoods in Isfahan and the back channels of Tehran's professional class. He didn't recruit with threats. He recruited with understanding. He knew the language, the silences, the way a middle-class Iranian in 2025 could simultaneously despise the Islamic Republic and be terrified to say it out loud in the wrong room. He had built something rare in intelligence work, a network that trusted him. Not because they were paid well, though some were, because Reza understood that trust in this business is not transactional, it is architectural. You build it slowly, over years, and if you rush it or exploit it or ask too much of it too soon, it doesn't just crack, it collapses in ways that get people killed. In November 2025, Reza submitted an assessment. 7 pages. Careful language. Bureaucratic in tone but precise in conclusion. He had spent 4 weeks reviewing the state of every asset network he controlled, cross-referencing with signals intelligence, with diaspora reporting, with everything he could access. And what he found, laid out with the kind of methodical clarity that intelligence officers use when they are trying very hard not to sound like they're contradicting their superiors, was this: the conditions that existed inside Iran in 2022 no longer exist in the same form. The assessment was received. It was logged. A senior officer thanked him for his thoroughness. And then the decision kept moving. To understand what Mossad believed it was building in early 2026, you have to go back to one night in September 2022. A 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman named Mahsa Amini was arrested by Iran's morality police in Tehran for allegedly wearing her hijab improperly. She died in custody 3 days later. The cause of death, according to her family, was a blow to the head. According to the Iranian government, it was a heart attack. Nobody outside the regime believed the government's version. What followed was the largest sustained protest movement inside Iran in a generation. Millions of people, across dozens of cities, chanting, "Woman, life, freedom." Young women burning their headscarves in the street. Crowds outside police stations. University students who had grown up under the Islamic Republic looking directly into cameras and saying, "Enough." The IRGC and Bassage crushed it. Hundreds were killed, thousands arrested. The executions came later, quiet and methodical, designed to erase not just individuals but the memory of their courage. But Israeli intelligence had watched 2022 with extraordinary attention, not just as observers, as analysts looking for what it revealed about the structural condition of the Islamic Republic, and what they concluded across a series of assessments that would eventually feed into Mossad's 2026 planning model was this: the Iranian regime is more brittle than it appears. The protests were not an anomaly, they were a symptom. The fractures are real, they are deep, and the right external pressure, applied at the right moment, could widen them beyond the regime's ability to contain. This was not an unreasonable conclusion. It was, in fact, a serious analytical position held by serious people. The problem was not that the conclusion was stupid. The problem was that it was 4 years old by the time it was being used to plan a war. Reza had been inside those 2022 assessments. He had contributed to some of them. He believed, at the time, that the fracture reading was broadly correct. What he watched in the 3 years that followed changed his view in ways that the broader analytical model did not fully absorb. He watched the Bassage adapt. After 2022, the Iranian security apparatus conducted what can only be described as a systematic institutional autopsy of its own failures. Neighborhood surveillance was rebuilt from the ground up. Informant networks were expanded. Social media monitoring, already extensive, became granular enough to flag individuals based on patterns of association, not just content. The VPN crackdown was not just technical, it was used as a list. If you were using a VPN in a certain neighborhood after a certain date, you were flagged. He watched the protest infrastructure dissolve. The organizers who survived 2022 were not waiting in readiness for the next moment. Many had left Iran. Many had gone silent. Many had simply, quietly, decided that the cost of visibility was too high and the probability of outside support was too low. And he watched something subtler, something harder to put in an intelligence report but impossible to ignore if you had spent a decade reading Iranian society. The mood of the Iranian middle class, which had been the backbone of 2022, had shifted, not toward the regime. They still despised the Islamic Republic, but despising something and being willing to stand in the street while the bossage has live ammunition are two entirely different psychological positions. What Reza was reading, by late 2025, looked less like a revolution waiting for its spark and more like a population waiting for the violence to be over. In January 2026, Mossad Director David Barnea traveled to Washington. The meetings were not publicized. The participants were senior, NSC staff, intelligence principals, people who had spent years watching Iran and years waiting for an opportunity to act on what they saw. Barnea's message was direct. Mossad had built networks, cultivated assets, and developed operational infrastructure inside Iran that could be activated in coordination with military strikes. Once the bombs began falling, the agency could, within days, begin catalyzing the internal pressure that would turn a military campaign into something far more consequential. He used the word uprising with the confidence of someone describing a thing that had already been stress-tested. The Trump administration officials in the room did not push back hard. Some of them had waited 20 years to hear exactly this kind of briefing. The intelligence that confirmed the plan was embraced. The intelligence that questioned it. The CIA's own private assessments, which several analysts later described as deeply skeptical of the uprising scenario, did not change the outcome of those meetings. Reza was not in Washington. He was in Tel Aviv, at his desk, running his network. He did not know the full scope of what Barnea had promised. What he knew was that in the weeks following those meetings, the operational tempo inside his division began to accelerate. Requests came in for updated asset assessments, for readiness evaluations, for timelines. He gave honest answers. Some of his colleagues, he suspected, gave optimistic ones. There is a dynamic in intelligence institutions, in any institution operating under political pressure, where the assessment that confirms the desired course of action moves faster than the assessment that complicates it. This is not conspiracy. It is not even conscious. It is something closer to gravity. The path of least resistance in a bureaucracy runs toward confirmation. Reza filed his assessments. They were received and logged and thanked. And somewhere above his pay grade, a war was being planned around a promise. What Reza didn't know yet, couldn't know yet in January 2026, was which of his assets would still be alive by summer. He had 17 active sources inside Iran. Some had been with him for nearly a decade. One was a civil engineer in Isfahan who had never missed a dead drop in 4 years. One was a mid-level administrator in a government ministry who passed documents through a method so unremarkable it had never once triggered scrutiny. The question that would keep Reza awake in the months that followed was not whether the plan would work. It was whether, by the time anyone in authority admitted it wasn't working, he would still have anyone left to protect. Operation Rising Lion began before dawn. The strikes were precise, layered, and devastating in their execution. Nuclear enrichment facilities in Natanz and Fordow took direct hits. Missile production infrastructure in sites near Isfahan was reduced to rubble in under 3 hours. 3 senior IRGC commanders, men whose names had been on Israeli target lists for years, were dead before Tehran's emergency sirens stopped echoing. By any tactical measure, the opening phase was a success. The kind of success that gets written up in military histories, the kind that commanders point to when they need to demonstrate competence. Reza was watching from a secure terminal in Tel Aviv. He had been at his desk since 2 a.m. Around him, people who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment were watching the strike confirmations come in with something close to controlled exhilaration. He was watching something else. he was watching his phones. The network Reza managed operated on a simple activation logic. When conditions inside Iran shifted significantly, when street mood changed, when security forces showed signs of stress, when gathering was possible, his assets would send prearranged signals. Not messages, signals. A pattern of behavior, a check-in at a specific time, a particular absence of communication that itself communicated something. In the first 6 hours after the strikes began, his network was almost completely quiet. Not silent in the way of assets who have been compromised, silent in the way of people who are watching, waiting, and calculating whether the moment is real or whether it will pass like the other moments that turned out not to be moments at all. Reza logged the absence. He sent a carefully worded inquiry to 3 of his most reliable assets, the civil engineer in Isfahan, a contact in Tehran's western districts, a source in the Kurdish regions near Kermanshah, who had been flagged in the planning model as a potential early mover. The replies came back within 12 hours. All 3 said variations of the same thing. The streets are calm. People are watching news at home. No one is gathering. The security presence has tripled since the strikes began. He flagged it upward. The response he received was not dismissive, it was patient. Give it more time. The model accounts for a lag. People need to see sustained pressure before they move. The IRGC commanders are dead. Let that register. This was a reasonable position. Revolutionary momentum does not ignite the moment a spark is struck. There is always a pause, a holding of breath, before the crowd decides what it is. But Reza had been reading Iranian society for 11 years, and the pause he was reading did not feel like held breath. It felt like a population that had already decided. What was happening inside Iran in those first 72 hours was not what Mossad's model had predicted, and the reason was structural, not incidental. The model had been built on the assumption that the IRGC strikes would perform a specific psychological function. They would prove to ordinary Iranians that the regime's protective shield had been shattered. That the men who had spent decades telling the Iranian people that they were untouchable, divinely protected, militarily invincible, were in fact mortal. And that this proof of mortality would translate into permission, psychological permission, for the street to move. The problem was that the Iranian security apparatus had not waited for this scenario to develop. Within the first 24 hours of the strikes, the Basij, the street-level enforcement arm that actually suppresses public gatherings, had deployed at a scale that had not been seen since the most intense days of 2022. They were not responding to protests. They were preempting them. Neighborhood by neighborhood, they established visible presence at every location that had been a gathering point during the 2022 protests. Major intersections, university gates, mosque courtyards that had historically served as assembly points. The message was not subtle. It was not meant to be. The message was, we know what you're thinking, and the cost of acting on it is standing right in front of you. Reza's asset in Tehran's western districts sent a message on the 3rd day that Reza would later describe, to a colleague, as the one that shifted his internal assessment from concern to alarm. The asset wrote, in the encoded phrasing they used, that his neighbor, a retired schoolteacher in her 60s, a woman who had wept during the 2022 protests and told her family she wanted to go to the street but was afraid, had said something that morning that he felt Reza needed to know. She had said, "This is not our war. This is their war, and we are in the middle of it." One retired schoolteacher is not data, but Reza had spent 11 years learning to read individual signals as proxies for collective mood, and what this signal said, when combined with everything else he was seeing, was something the planning model had not adequately weighted. There is a difference between a population that hates its government and a population that is ready to act. Between those two states sits a third condition that intelligence planners consistently underestimate. A population that hates its government and has concluded, from bitter experience, that acting will cost them everything and change nothing. The Iranian street had not forgotten 2022. They remembered it with great precision. They remembered the faces of the people who had stood in the light and what had happened to those faces afterward. On day 5, Reza requested an internal meeting. He brought his assessment in writing, 8 pages this time, not 7. He presented the network data, the absence of activation signals, the feedback from assets, the Basij deployment patterns, the social media blackout that had gone up faster than it had in 2022. He made his case methodically, without drama, in the language of operational risk. He said, "The window for a street-level operation may already have closed. I recommend we pivot network resources to asset preservation before we begin losing people." There were 4 people in the room. 2 of them were operational colleagues who broadly agreed with his reading. One was a senior analytical officer who said the model still held and that they needed more time. One was a senior figure who said very little and who, Reza noticed, was checking his phone throughout the meeting. The recommendation was not rejected outright. It was, in the language of institutional bureaucracy, noted for further review. In intelligence work, noted for further review is how things that cannot be officially acknowledged are officially set aside. Here's the assumption that Phase 1 never fully examined. The 2026 Iran uprising model was built on the Syria lesson. Not explicitly, no planning document said Iran equals Syria, but implicitly in the logic of its architecture. The assumption was, find the fracture lines, degrade the regime's coercive capacity, and the structure will lose its internal coherence. Syria had worked that way, an Alawite minority ruling a Sunni majority through force alone. When the force was disrupted, the structure that existed only through force began to come apart. But Iran is not Syria, and the people inside Israeli intelligence who knew this, who had said it in papers and assessments and quiet conversations for years, had never fully penetrated the planning model with that knowledge. Not because they were ignored. Because the Syria lesson was more emotionally satisfying, it was legible, it had a precedent. And in institutions under pressure to act, the legible historical parallel almost always beats the inconvenient structural distinction. Iran has a Shia majority governing a Shia theocratic state. The Revolutionary Guard is not merely a tool of the regime in the way the Syrian military was a tool of Assad's minority. For millions of Iranian families, the IRGC is a career, a pension, a social identity, a generational loyalty. You do not bomb that into opposition, you harden it. The Kurdish minority in western Iran, which the planning model had flagged as a potential uprising accelerant, a population with deep grievances and existing organizational infrastructure, had its own calculation. Reza's asset near Kermanshah sent a message on day 6 that contained a single sentence of devastating clarity. They want guarantees you cannot give them, and they know it. The Kurds had been promised outside support before. In 1975, when the Shah and Saddam agreed to halt support for Kurdish rebellion, and an entire movement was abandoned overnight. The memory was not abstract. It was constitutional to how they made decisions. They would not move without guarantees. The guarantees would require a level of commitment that neither Israel nor the United States was prepared to formalize. And everyone in the room, on all sides, understood this, and no one said it out loud in a way that stopped the plan from proceeding. At the political level, something was happening that Reza would only reconstruct much later. Within the first week of the war, certain senior figures in the Israeli government and the Trump NSC had already privately updated their expectations. The revolution was not coming. The assessment had shifted, the decision had been made, not announced, not formally communicated, certainly not passed down to the field, to quietly reframe the war's objectives around what had actually been achieved: nuclear degradation, missile infrastructure damage, IRGC leadership elimination. These were real achievements, significant ones. But the field operation, Reza's operation, his assets, his network, was still running on the original mission framework, still pushing, still taking risks calibrated to a revolution that, at the highest levels of government, had already been silently abandoned. No one told Reza. The question that would define everything that followed was not whether the revolution was coming. It was how many people would be asked to risk their lives for it before someone finally said, in a room where it counted, that it wasn't. On day 7, something happened that changed Reza's internal calculation, temporarily, dangerously, in exactly the wrong direction. A contact in Isfahan sent an activation signal. Not a message, the signal. The specific pattern of behavior that Reza had spent months establishing with this particular asset. The one that meant conditions are shifting, people are talking, there is movement here. Reza sat with it for 40 minutes before he did anything. He read it twice. He checked the timestamp against the asset's established patterns. He cross-referenced it with what his other Isfahan area source had sent 6 hours earlier, which had been quiet but not alarmed. He looked for the signs of a compromised asset sending a false positive under duress. the small inconsistencies in timing and phrasing that his training had taught him to read like a second language. He didn't find them. What he found looked, by every operational measure he had, like a genuine signal from a reliable source in a city where the IRGC had just lost a senior commander to an Israeli strike 48 hours earlier. He escalated it. The response from above was fast, faster than anything in the previous week had moved. Within 2 hours, Reza was in a room with 4 senior officers discussing what an activation in Isfahan could mean for the broader model. The analytical officer who had disagreed with him 3 days earlier was now using words like tipping point and cascade potential. Someone mentioned the civil engineer, Reza's most reliable Isfahan asset, the one who had never missed a dead drop in 4 years, and asked whether he could be tasked with direct ground assessment. Reza said he needed more time to verify the initial signal before expanding tasking. He was told they didn't have time. The political window was compressing. If there was movement in Isfahan, they needed to know its scope, and they needed to know it within 24 hours. This is the moment Reza would return to repeatedly in the months that followed. Not with drama, with the specific, quiet, devastating clarity of someone who knows exactly where he could have stopped and didn't. He approved the expanded tasking. The civil engineer in Isfahan received his instructions through the established channel. He was asked to make 3 specific observations over the following 18 hours. Assess gathering activity near the university district. Evaluate the visible security presence at 2 locations that had been protest staging areas in 2022, and report on the general mood of his immediate professional network, the engineers, contractors, and mid-level government workers he interacted with daily. This was not an unreasonable ask. It was well within the scope of what the asset had done before. It required no direct action, no distribution of materials, no contact with anyone outside his normal patterns. What it required was movement through the city at a time when the Basij had tripled its street presence and the Iranian security apparatus was specifically looking for exactly the kind of person the civil engineer was: educated, urban, professionally connected, old enough to have participated in previous protest cycles. The civil engineer moved. He completed the first 2 observations without incident. His report came back through the channel at hour 14. Security presence was heavy but not extraordinary. No visible gathering activity at either location. The university district was quiet in a way that felt imposed rather than organic. Reza read that and felt the initial activation signal begin to deflate in his assessment. Imposed quiet was the phrase that snagged him. An asset with 4 years of reliability describing silence as something the Basij was actively manufacturing, rather than something the population had chosen, that was a different reading than tipping point. That was a population being held down, not a population waiting to rise. He was drafting a revised assessment when the 3rd report came in. It didn't come from the civil engineer. It came from a secondary contact, someone the civil engineer had spoken to during his observation round, a former colleague from a construction project who had, apparently, said something that the engineer felt was significant enough to pass along immediately outside the normal protocol. The former colleague had said that he knew people who were organizing, that there was a network, that it was real, and it was waiting for a clearer signal that outside support was genuine and not performative. In a different intelligence environment with different pressure, Reza would have flagged this as a protocol violation and done nothing further until he had assessed the secondary contact independently, verified the claim, and established whether the civil engineer's deviation from protocol had itself been observed. He didn't have that environment. He had a room full of senior officers who had just been told that a reliable asset in Isfahan was reporting the existence of an active organizing network, and who were now looking at Reza with the specific expression that people wear when they believe the thing they have been waiting for is finally, actually, happening. The analytical officer said, "This is exactly what the model predicted. Decentralized, quiet, waiting for confirmation of external commitment." Reza said, "The source is unverified. The civil engineer broke protocol to pass this. We need to treat both facts as equally important." He was told that field conditions sometimes require protocol flexibility, that the engineer's judgment had been reliable for 4 years, that they needed to know whether this network was real. He was asked to task the civil engineer to make direct contact with the secondary source and establish the network's scope. Reza asked for 24 hours to do an independent assessment first. He was given 12. In those 12 hours, he ran everything he could through available channels. He checked the secondary contact's name, which the civil engineer had included, A second protocol deviation that itself should have been a stopping signal against every database accessible to him. He found nothing alarming. The name matched a real person, a real professional history, a real presence in Isfahan's construction industry. He found nothing alarming because the Iranian security apparatus, which had spent 4 years since 2022 building exactly this kind of operation, had constructed the profile specifically to survive the kind of check Reza was running. He didn't know that yet. What he knew, at the end of his 12 hours, was that he could not definitively prove the secondary source was a plant. And in the institutional logic of a running operation under political pressure, the inability to prove a negative becomes, functionally, clearance to proceed. He approved the direct contact tasking. The civil engineer made contact with the secondary source the following afternoon. The meeting lasted 22 minutes, in a tea house 2 kilometers from the engineer's workplace, in the middle of a workday, in plain sight of a street that Reza would later identify, too late, as one of 7 locations in Isfahan where the Mossad had established covert observation posts specifically designed to monitor professional class movement patterns after the strikes. Nothing happened at the meeting. No arrests, no confrontation. The engineer returned to work. He sent his report through the channel that evening. The organizing network, he said, was real. 8 to 12 people. They were waiting for a signal from outside that resources and protection were available. Reza read the report, and for approximately 6 hours, he allowed himself to believe it. This is the false release moment, the point in every failing operation where the pressure briefly lifts, and the people running it exhale and tell each other that the model was right after all, that the patience was worth it, that the groundwork is real. Reza drafted an updated assessment. Cautious language, he was constitutionally incapable of writing any other kind, but directionally positive. A potential organizing network in Isfahan. Unverified but sourced through a reliable primary asset. Recommend further evaluation before activation. He sent it up the chain at 11 p.m. By the time he arrived at his desk the following morning, the assessment had already been used, excerpted, summarized, stripped of its qualifications. In a briefing that went significantly higher than his division, the words potential and unverified had not survived the journey upward. What arrived at the political level was something closer to Mossad asset confirms active resistance network in Isfahan. Reza found out what had happened to his assessment from a colleague who had been in the briefing room. He sat with that information for a long time. He thought about the civil engineer, about the tea house, about the 22 minutes. He thought about the fact that the secondary source had suggested a follow-up meeting, that the engineer had agreed to it, that the follow-up was already scheduled. He thought about whether he had enough to justify pulling the engineer out now, before the follow-up, and what it would cost operationally and institutionally to do so. He thought about the fact that he had been awake for 19 hours, and that his judgment, at 19 hours, was not the same as his judgment at 8. He did not pull the engineer. He told himself he would reassess in the morning, after sleep, with clearer eyes. He would spend a long time later examining that decision. The follow-up meeting never happened. Not because it was canceled. Because 41 hours after the civil engineer sat in that tea house for 22 minutes, he did not check in at his scheduled time. Reza waited. He ran the absence against the established protocol. Late check-ins had a specific meaning. Missed check-ins had another. He sent a careful inquiry through the secondary channel. Nothing came back. In intelligence work, there is a particular quality to that silence. It is different from the silence of an asset who is busy, or traveling, or managing a family situation. It has a specific weight. Reza had felt it twice before in 11 years. Both times, the asset was gone. He sat with it for 2 hours. Then, he began the process of compartmentalizing the engineer's network, severing the connections, sending warning signals to adjacent assets, trying to contain whatever damage had already begun spreading from that tea house, from that street, from that 22 minutes. It was, by then, too late to contain all of it. The secondary source was, as Reza had half suspected and could not prove, an Iranian intelligence plant. The Boss's counterintelligence division, the unit specifically tasked with identifying and neutralizing foreign-linked internal networks, had spent 4 years since 2022 rebuilding its human intelligence infrastructure with exactly this operation in mind. Not this specific operation. This type of operation. They had anticipated that when the moment came, when Israel struck, when the pressure mounted, foreign intelligence services would attempt to activate whatever networks they had built inside Iran. They had built traps designed to look like networks. The civil engineer had walked into one. Not because he was careless, because he was asked to move faster than the tradecraft could safely support, under institutional pressure that had overridden the one voice in the room arguing for restraint. The engineer's fate became known 3 months later through a source inside Evin prison. He had been arrested the morning after Reza's missed check-in. The circumstances of what followed are not something this account will detail. What can be said is that he did not survive detention. He had been working with Reza for 4 years. He had never missed a dead drop. The damage did not stop with the engineer. The Basage's counterintelligence unit is patient in a way that Western intelligence services consistently underestimate. They did not immediately move against every contact the engineer had touched. They watched. They mapped. They followed threads with the methodical attention of people who have no deadline and unlimited jurisdiction inside their own country. Over the following 6 weeks, 4 additional members of Reza's Isfahan network went dark. 2 of Reza's Tehran area assets independently sent messages saying they were suspending contact and would not resume communication for an indeterminate period. The Kurdish network near Kermanshah, which had already been reluctant, went entirely silent after a mid-level coordinator was reportedly detained at a checkpoint near the Iraqi border. Reza tracked each loss on a document he kept separate from the official operational log. Not because he was hiding it, because he was trying to understand the shape of it. Whether the losses were connected to the engineer's exposure or represented independent failures. Whether there was a pattern that could tell him how deep the penetration went. The pattern he found was worse than a single penetration. It suggested that the Iranian counterintelligence apparatus had been running parallel operations against multiple nodes of his network for months before the war began, using the war and the pressure it created as the event that would cause those nodes to activate and expose themselves. The war had not created the vulnerability. The war had revealed it. By the 3rd week of the war, the revolution that had been promised to Netanyahu and sold to the Trump administration had been quietly removed from the list of achievable objectives. This was not announced. It did not appear in any public statement. What happened instead was the gradual, institutional recalibration that governments perform when a strategic assumption fails. The slow replacement of one set of language with another, the disappearance of certain goals from briefings and press conferences, the emergence of a narrower and more defensible version of success. The war's objectives, as they were now described, centered on nuclear degradation and the elimination of ballistic missile infrastructure. These were real. They were significant. Operation Rising Lion had achieved genuine and measurable damage to Iran's military-industrial capacity, and that damage would take years to rebuild. But regime change was gone from the language. The uprising was gone. The internal resistance network that had been described, in a stripped and overconfident briefing, as confirmed and active in Isfahan, gone. When the ceasefire came, Netanyahu spoke with the careful discipline of a man who has learned which subjects to approach obliquely. He discussed what had been achieved. He did not discuss what had been promised. When a journalist asked whether Israel had accomplished regime change or the elimination of Iran's missile program, the question was redirected into language about long-term pressure and strategic positioning. The Islamic Republic was still standing. The Basij was still operational. The IRGC, depleted at the command level, was already beginning the process of promoting the generation below, younger, angrier, more certain in their institutional identity than the men who had been killed, because the men who had been killed had at least lived through a period when the Islamic Republic felt optional. The generation replacing them had grown up knowing nothing else. The broader strategic cost was not merely that the uprising failed, it was that the operation's failure was architecturally invisible to the people who needed to learn from it. Because the war had achieved real military objectives, the failure of its political intelligence dimension could be absorbed into the overall narrative of success. The revolution that was promised could be described, by those inclined to describe it this way, as an objective that was always secondary, aspirational, contingent, worth attempting, but not fundamental to the campaign's value. This framing protected the people who had made the promise. It also ensured that the structural error, the misapplication of the Syria model to Iran, the inflation of 2022's protest moment into a durable revolutionary condition, the systematic elevation of confirming assessments over dissenting ones, was never fully examined in the institutional context where it could change future practice. Reza submitted a final after-action document 6 weeks after the ceasefire. 17 pages, it detailed, with the same methodical precision as his earlier assessments, every decision point where the operation had diverged from sound tradecraft, every moment where institutional pressure had overridden field judgment, every asset loss that could be traced to the acceleration of a timeline that the evidence had never supported. He received an acknowledgement. He retired from active operations the following year. The networks Reza had spent 11 years building inside Iran were, in his own private characterization, burned. Not entirely, some assets remained intact, in deep cover, too carefully constructed to have been touched by the Isfahan exposure. But the Isfahan network was gone. The Tehran area infrastructure was reduced to a fraction of its previous capacity. The Kurdish regional network had gone silent in a way that operational experience suggested was not temporary. Rebuilding would take years, possibly a decade, and it would need to start from near zero in the regions where exposure had been deepest, which meant the regions that mattered most, the industrial centers, the cities with protest history, the areas where an actual popular movement, if one ever emerged, would begin. The civil engineer's family received nothing. They could not be told anything. In the geometry of covert operations, the people who pay the final cost are the ones whose sacrifice cannot be acknowledged, whose names cannot be said, whose contribution to a failed plan cannot be entered into any record that their children might one day read. Reza knew his name. He will know it for the rest of his life. There is a version of this story that ends with lessons learned, doctrine reformed, institutions made wiser by failure. Intelligence agencies do sometimes absorb hard lessons and change. It happens. What more often happens is this: the people who were right get noted and moved aside. The people who were wrong get protected by the partial success that surrounded their failure. And the next planning cycle begins with a new model, new assessments, new intelligence products that open with the familiar words. This time, the conditions are different. If you want to understand how intelligence failures compound across generations, you don't look at the single catastrophic error. You look at how institutions make the same structural mistake in different clothes, in different countries, in different decades because the error was never properly named the first time. That is what Reza's 17 pages tried to name. Whether anyone read them carefully enough to remember what they said, that is a question this story cannot answer.